The orange ribbon was tied at eye level, exactly like the ones we'd been following for the past 40 minutes. But this one made me stop. Sarah and I had been moving quickly since we turned away from the man in the canvas jacket. He had no pack, no radio, and no reason to be standing that far inside the forest. Still, he'd calmly told us the parking lot was ahead. The ribbon's knot was tight and deliberate. Its ends had been cut clean, and the tape showed no fading or rain damage. It could have been tied that morning. I turned around. The trail curved behind us, hiding the last marker. The official route should have been running parallel somewhere to the east. That was what we believed when the blowdown and temporary-looking detour markers led us away from it. I opened the map and checked our position again. We were more than 1.5 miles off course, heading northwest into a drainage basin with no marked trails, roads, or structures. The parking lot wasn't ahead. There was nothing ahead but forest. And the man we had just spoken to knew that. Before we get started tonight, go ahead and subscribe to Mind After Dark. If you haven't already, drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. We read more of those than you'd think, and it genuinely helps the channel reach new listeners. We appreciate every single one of you. All right, let's begin. Story 1. The trail that wasn't on the map. Sarah and I had been planning this trip since mid-August. We both had the Friday off, which gave us a 3-day weekend for an overnight backpacking loop in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington. We'd done overnights in the Olympics and along sections of the PCT in Oregon, so we weren't new to backcountry travel. We had a printed topo map, offline trails downloaded on both our phones through Gaia, a written itinerary pinned to the fridge at Sarah's sister's apartment, and an extra day's worth of food packed in case something went sideways. The loop was about 16 miles total, 7 in on Friday to a backcountry camp, 9 out on Saturday. 3,200 feet of elevation gain spread across the whole route. The forecast was dry and cool, about as good as early October gets in the Pacific Northwest. The first 5 miles were exactly what you hope for. Good weather, well-marked trail, golden light filtering through big leaf maples under a canopy of old-growth Douglas fir. We passed 2 groups heading the other direction. One couple told us the campsite we were aiming for was open and dry. Sarah was in a great mood. I was too. We were making better time than planned and talking about maybe extending Saturday's hike to a viewpoint the guidebook mentioned. Then we hit the blowdown. 3 large trees had come down across the trail, probably from the windstorm that had torn through the area a few weeks before the trip. The root balls were enormous, raw, dark earth still clinging to the exposed roots, and the trunks were stacked across the path in a way that made getting over them with full packs genuinely difficult. Not impossible, but it would have meant climbing over wet, slick bark 4 feet off the ground with 40 pounds on your back. Sarah studied the blowdown for a minute and said she thought she could climb over the second trunk if she took her pack off and handed it across. I looked at the angle and wasn't sure. The bark was mossy on the uphill side, and there was a gap between the second and third trunk where a slip would mean dropping into a tangle of branches. We talked about it for a few minutes, whether to try it, whether to look for a way around. That's when I noticed the detour markers. To the right of the blowdown, someone had placed a small wooden stake in the ground with a strip of orange flagging tape tied to the top. It looked temporary, like a construction marker. Behind it, a narrow but clear side trail headed off to the northwest. A second orange ribbon was tied to a branch about 60 feet further in, at eye level. Then a third, barely visible beyond that. The spacing was consistent. "Looks like a reroute," Sarah said. It did. Forest Service detours aren't always announced in advance, and we'd already seen chainsaw-cut logs earlier on the main trail, which suggested crews had been working in the area. The blowdown itself looked recent enough that a temporary reroute made sense. And the side trail initially ran roughly parallel to the official route. I checked the GPS, and for the first 10 minutes, the two paths stayed within maybe a quarter mile of each other. That parallel track was the thing that convinced me. If the detour was running alongside the main trail, it would presumably reconnect further ahead, past whatever section was blocked. I told Sarah I thought it was legitimate. She agreed. We followed the ribbons in. For 15 or 20 minutes, everything felt normal. The trail was narrow but clearly used. The ribbons appeared at regular intervals. The forest was dense, second-growth fir with a thick understory of salal and sword fern. But the path was easy to follow. I checked the GPS twice during this stretch, and both times it showed us moving in roughly the right direction. The first thing that bothered me was a carcinite post. One of those standard brown fiberglass trail markers with a small directional arrow. It was standing beside the trail, but the arrow was pointing back the way we'd come. I assumed wind or an animal had twisted it. Sarah tried to straighten it, but the base held firm in the ground. It hadn't been loosened by weather. Someone had deliberately rotated it. I told myself it was vandalism. It happens on public land. The second thing was the GPS. About 25 minutes in, I checked it again and noticed the side trail was no longer running parallel. It had been curving gradually to the northwest, and we were now a full mile from the official route, heading into a drainage basin that appeared on both the printed map and the digital topo as completely trailless. No paths, no roads, no structures, nothing. I said something to Sarah. She'd been noticing the same drift, but had assumed, like me, that the reroute was about to curve back. We stopped walking and looked ahead. The ribbons continued disappearing into denser forest. "I think we should go back," I said. "Yeah," she said. "I think so too." We turned around. That's when we met the man. He was standing about 50 feet off the trail, slightly uphill, in a gap between two large cedars. Olive green work pants, brown canvas jacket, dark baseball cap. He looked like someone who worked outdoors. A timber worker maybe, or a utility contractor. He wasn't carrying anything. No pack, no water, no tools, no radio. Just standing there, hands at his sides, watching us. I raised my hand. After a pause, he waved back. Then he walked down toward the trail with an unhurried, easy stride. He said hello, asked if we were heading back to the parking area. I said yes. He said the trail continued ahead and came out near the lot, maybe another mile. Said it like it was friendly advice, nothing more. Sarah asked if he worked for the Forest Service. He paused, just a beat, and said he did some volunteer trail maintenance. She asked which organization. He said he couldn't remember the exact name, that a friend had signed him up. No badge, no vest, no radio, no volunteer credentials of any kind. His boots were heavy, lug-soled, and the tread pattern matched the fresh prints we'd seen in the mud earlier. Prints that appeared on the trail and then vanished, as if whoever made them had stepped off the path and walked into the trees. I told him thanks, that we were heading back the way we came. He nodded, didn't argue, didn't press. but the calm in his face felt practiced, like someone who'd had this conversation before us. We walked past him, and within 30 seconds, I couldn't hear anything behind us. No footsteps, no brush moving, just silence. That silence was worse than following would have been. We moved fast, almost jogging. The ribbons looked different to me now. One was tied to a freshly cut branch, the exposed wood still pale and damp. Another was knotted so hastily it hung at knee height. These weren't Forest Service markers. They were one person's project. About 10 minutes into the return, I stopped beside a ribbon that was perfectly tied, perfectly placed, and perfectly fresh. That was the moment from the beginning of this story. The moment the map confirmed we were 1.5 miles off course, heading into nothing, and that every direction the man had pointed us would have taken us deeper. Sarah grabbed my arm. Keep moving? A few minutes later, the trail passed through a shallow depression screened by undergrowth. Something off to the left caught my eye. A glimpse of blue behind a rock outcrop. I slowed down. Through the brush, maybe 30 feet from the path, I could see a tarp strung between 2 trees. Under it, a blue backpack lay on its side with the main compartment open and empty. Beside it, a green day pack, also empty, a plastic bin, and propped against the rock a piece of cardboard with photographs attached in rows. I couldn't make out the images, but the arrangement was deliberate, organized. On the ground, near the bin, catching the low afternoon light, sat a set of keys on a carabiner. Sarah saw it at the same time I did. Are those car keys? I pulled out my phone and took 4 photographs from the trail without stepping closer. Sarah took 2 more from a slightly different angle. Neither of us moved toward the camp. We looked at each other and the conversation happened without words. We left. Climbing back over the blowdown was harder than I expected. Sarah went first, handing her pack across the gap between trunks while I braced against the root ball. My foot slipped on the mossy bark, and I caught myself on a branch that cracked under my weight. For a few seconds, I was half straddling the second trunk with my pack pulling me backward, and all I could think about was that the man knew this blowdown was here. He knew it was the only way back to the main trail, and he knew exactly how long it would take us to get over it. We made it across. Back on the official route, we turned southeast and started the 5-mile hike back to the parking area. We weren't completing the loop. We weren't camping. We were getting out. The light was fading. We had a little under 2.5 hours of usable daylight and 5 miles of trail to cover with full packs and tired legs. Sarah asked about headlamps. Should we get them out now or save the batteries? I said save them. If we needed them for the last mile, fine, but I didn't want to drain a battery we might need later. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I didn't want a light on our heads, making us visible on the trail after dark. We hiked fast. My feet were aching and Sarah's knee was bothering her. She mentioned it once and then stopped talking about it, which told me it was worse than she was letting on. Every few minutes I looked behind us. The trail was empty, but I kept thinking about the fact that someone who knew these woods, who wasn't carrying a pack and wasn't following the trail, could move through the forest much faster than we could on the path. He could reach the parking area before us if he knew a direct route. And he clearly knew these woods. We reached the car with maybe 20 minutes of light left. The lot was empty except for our vehicle. It was untouched, doors locked, nothing disturbed. But there was a second set of tire tracks in the gravel that hadn't been there when we arrived that morning. They came in from the access road, circled the lot once, and left. We drove out immediately. My phone found a signal about 8 miles down the forest road, and I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. I described what we'd found and gave them the trailhead location. The dispatcher said she'd pass it to the on-duty deputy and suggested we also contact the Forest Service. The Cowlitz Valley Ranger District office in Randall wasn't open until Monday. We went in that morning and showed the ranger my photographs, the empty backpacks, the keys, the organized photographs on the cardboard. He studied them for a long time without saying anything. Then he thanked us, took copies, and said he'd send someone to the area. He didn't elaborate on what they expected to find. I called back 2 weeks later. The ranger I spoke with said they'd located signs of a camp in the general area, but that materials had been removed before they reached it. He couldn't share anything else. I don't know what was at the far end of that side trail. I don't know if the blowdown that pushed us onto the detour was natural or arranged. But the orange ribbons weren't placed by the Forest Service. The trail signs were rotated. And the things under that tarp, the empty packs, the keys, the photographs, didn't belong to the man standing between the cedars. They belonged to someone who followed the ribbons before we did. Story 2. The trail that had been erased, some identifying details in this story, including the trail name and exact location, have been changed. I've always preferred older guidebooks. I know most people use apps now, and I carry a phone with offline maps. But there's something about a printed guide written by someone who actually walked the trail that I trust differently. The descriptions are physical. They tell you where the creek gets tricky in spring, where the wind hits the ridge, where you'll lose the path if you're not watching. A GPS pin doesn't give you that. The guidebook I was using that September was a 2003 edition of a West Virginia hiking guide I'd found at a library sale. I'd done most of the trails over the years, but a handful in the eastern mountains had never worked out. Too far, too late in the season, bad weather. One of them was a route I'll call the Kinney Fork Trail. The book described it as a 6-mile out and back following an old logging road along a creek drainage, climbing gradually to a ridge line with long views to the east. Moderate difficulty. Remote access. I drove up on a Tuesday. Late September, clear skies, low 60s. Perfect weather. The drive took me down progressively worse roads until I was on a single-lane dirt track with grass growing between the tire ruts. When I reached the spot the guidebook described, there was room to pull off on the shoulder. The book said the trailhead would be marked with a wooden sign on the left side of the road. The sign was gone. The post was still standing, cut off cleanly about 2 feet from the ground. Sawed, not snapped. The cut was old and gray. Near the post, nailed to a tree about chest height, was a small handmade wooden arrow. It was weathered, gray, cracked at the edges. The nail rusted and staining the bark below it. It pointed toward a gap in the rhododendron. Someone had carved a few letters into the wood below the arrow, but they were so worn I could only make out the first 2. It looked like it had been there for years, long enough that whoever made it might have put it up while the trail was still official, or shortly after the sign was removed, when the route was still fresh in local memory. I checked my offline topo map. I downloaded terrain data for this quadrangle before the trip, but I hadn't thought to grab the current public land boundary layer. The terrain showed the creek drainage exactly where the guidebook described it. The contours matched the book's description of a gradual climb. I compared the two, landmark by landmark. The creek to the right, the rhododendron corridor, and the initial southwest bearing, and everything lined up. I locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and headed in. The first mile and a half showed its age. The old logging road was visible beneath overgrowth, but the brush was thick. Rhododendron and mountain laurel pressing in from both sides, creating a tunnel effect that blocked most of the sky. Fallen branches crossed the path every 100 feet or so. The roadbed was rutted and soft in places where drainage had eroded it. This was not a maintained trail. It hadn't been maintained in years. But the corridor was still walkable, and the guidebook's landmarks kept appearing. The creek audible to my right, the gradual southwest, bearing confirmed by compass, a stand of old hemlocks the book mentioned as a waypoint. Then I hit the fence. Old barbed wire on leaning wooden posts. Most sections were sagging or down entirely. One section had been cut and pulled aside, leaving a gap wide enough to walk through. I examined the post near the gap for a posted sign or boundary marker. Nothing. The wire was rusted dark, the posts weathered and soft. It looked like a remnant from decades of grazing use, the kind of fence that predates the Forest Service in parts of West Virginia, left standing because nobody ever bothered to take it down. In the guidebook, there was no mention of a fence. I assumed the book's author had passed through the same gap without noting it, or that the fence had been in better repair and more clearly abandoned at the time. I stepped through. The trail changed immediately after the fence. The logging road faded to a narrow footpath through denser forest. Big hardwoods now, oak and hickory and tulip poplar, starting to turn color. The understory was thick enough that I couldn't see more than 30 or 40 feet in any direction. But the path was clear. Someone was still using it, or had been recently enough to keep it from being swallowed entirely. About 20 minutes past the fence, I stopped for water and leaned my trekking pole against a beech tree. I took a long drink, wiped my mouth, checked the compass, and turned to grab the pole. It wasn't there. I stared at the tree. The pole was aluminum with a cork grip and a red wrist strap. It did not blend in. I looked at the ground, looked behind the tree, circled the area in a widening radius. Nothing. The pole had been leaning against a smooth-barked tree 6 feet from where I stood, and in the time it took me to drink water and check a compass, it had vanished. I stood still and listened. The forest was quiet. No wind, no birds, no water. Then, very faintly, somewhere off to my left and behind me, I heard a sound. A single soft snap like a dry twig breaking under weight. Then nothing. I waited a full minute. The sound didn't repeat. I had a second pole, so I wasn't stuck. But the experience had changed the hike completely. I was no longer curious about a ridgeline view. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been before, that I was alone in unfamiliar forest, on what might not be public land. With no cell signal and no one expecting me until evening, I kept going, and I shouldn't have. I think I was still operating on the assumption that the pole had somehow fallen into the brush and I'd missed it, and that the sound was an animal. I wanted to see what was ahead, confirm that the trail matched the guidebook, and turn around at a logical stopping point. That was bad reasoning, and I knew it even at the time, but I kept walking. 15 minutes later, I reached a clearing. At the far edge stood a cabin. Old construction, hand-hewn logs, rusted metal roof, one small window frame with no glass. The door was closed but warped at the bottom, showing a gap of several inches. Against the south wall, someone had stacked firewood. Some of it was fresh split. Pale, clean-cut faces, no weathering. Someone had been here recently, within days. The guidebook described no cabin, no structures of any kind. I checked my offline topo. My position had drifted from southwest to nearly due west, a gradual curve I hadn't caught because I'd been following the footpath instead of the compass. I was well off the guidebook's route, and the fence and occupied-looking cabin made private ownership seem likely even without boundary data. I turned around immediately. The return should have been straightforward. Same path, same direction, compass reversed. But about 10 minutes in, I reached a junction I didn't remember. 2 old logging spurs, branching off in similar directions, both heading roughly east. The spurs were almost identical. Same width, same degree of overgrowth, same general character. A flat rock sat at the junction, positioned in a way that could have been a directional marker. But depending on where you stood, it seemed to point either way. I'd only come in on one path, I was certain of that. But I couldn't tell which one it was. I took the left spur. Within 5 minutes, it dead-ended in a rhododendron thicket, so dense I would have needed a saw to get through. I backtracked, took the right spur, and after a few hundred yards it started to feel familiar. The same stand of hickory I remembered, the same slight rise in the terrain. That's where I found my trekking pole. It was leaning against a tree beside the trail, the wrist strap wound neatly around the cork grip. I always wind the strap that way when I stow the pole in my pack. I had not wound it that way before setting it down. Whoever picked it up had seen me carry it and knew how I stored it. They'd handled it, moved it a quarter mile, and placed it where I'd find it on my way out. I grabbed the pole and moved. Fast. Compass east, trail or no trail. When the path curved, I stayed on bearing. I hit the barbed wire fence after about 15 minutes, longer than it should have taken, which meant I'd been further west than I realized, and stepped through the gap without stopping. The rhododendron tunnel closed around me, and I half-jogged the logging road back to the truck. The truck was untouched. No damage, no sign of tampering. But under the windshield wiper on the driver's side was a folded piece of paper, torn from a pocket notebook lined. In block letters, someone had written, "No trail, private." I looked around. The road was empty in both directions. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense and still. Whoever left the note had been at my truck while I was in the woods. Whether they'd walked from the cabin or from somewhere else, I had no idea. I drove out without stopping. That evening, back in Morgantown, I did the research I should have done before the trip. The trail had been officially decommissioned in 2009. The upper section crossed private land, and the landowners had requested its closure. The Forest Service removed the trailhead sign, pulled the route from all current maps, and posted a closure notice on their website that I'd never thought to check. The handmade arrow at the trailhead was old enough to predate the closure, or to have been placed shortly after, when the trail was still fresh in local memory. But the person who managed the private land, the one who moved my pole, who may or may not have shifted that rock at the junction, who left the note on my truck, was operating in the present tense. Whether the arrow, the pole, the altered junction, and the note all came from the same person or from separate people, I couldn't determine. I still can't. What I know is that an outdated guidebook led me onto a trail that had been closed for years, across a fence onto private land, and to a cabin where someone had recently been living or working, and that at no point during the 3 hours I spent in those woods, was I actually alone, even though I never saw another person. The guidebook is still on my shelf. I haven't opened it since. Story 3. The False Cairns. My brother Marcus and I have a tradition. One big hike together every spring. He's in Denver, I'm in Flagstaff, and we usually meet somewhere in between. That year we picked the San Rafael Swell in east central Utah. Mesa country, sandstone canyons, enormous sky. Not a national park, not heavily trafficked. We planned a 12-mile loop through canyon bottoms and benchland, starting and finishing at a BLM parking area at the end of a long washboard road. We got there around 7. The lot held maybe 6 vehicles. Ours was the second one there. The first was a dusty white Chevy Tahoe, backed into a space at the far end, facing the exit. A man sat in the driver's seat with his window down looking at his phone. Mid-40s, gray t-shirt, nothing memorable about him. Marcus waved as we unloaded our packs. The man glanced up, gave a minimal nod, and went back to his phone. No hiking boots visible, no pack in the seat beside him, no water bottles. "Waiting for someone, I guess," Marcus said. We signed the trail register at the kiosk and started hiking. The first 4 miles were easy. Sandy wash, then up onto a bench of exposed sandstone. BLM markers at regular intervals, the occasional cairn confirming direction. By 8:30, the sky was cloudless and the heat was already building. I could feel the slick rock radiating warmth through my boot soles. We were carrying 3 liters each, enough for the full loop if we kept a steady pace, but not much margin for error. The problem started where the trail crossed a large expanse of bare sandstone. On slick rock, you depend entirely on cairns. Footprints don't register on stone. The official cairns had been spaced about 60 to 80 feet apart, close enough that you could always see the next one before leaving the last, standard for a BLM route in this kind of terrain. Then the spacing changed, a long gap, maybe 200 feet, and when I finally spotted the next cairn, it was off to the south. Further south than made sense based on our map. Marcus saw it too. "That's not right," I said. "The trail should be bending east here." Marcus checked the GPS on his phone. I was correct. The track showed the route curving northeast, but the cairn ahead was unmistakable. 5 or 6 flat stones stacked neatly, exactly like every cairn we'd been following all morning. And beyond it, I could see another one, still further south. They formed a clear line descending off the bench toward a narrow canyon below. "Maybe the trail was rerouted," Marcus said. "Could be an obstacle ahead on the old route." I looked at the cairns again. They were well built, same construction style, same proportionate size. If someone had faked them, they'd done an excellent job matching the real ones. The same flat hand-selected stones, the same careful balance. The only difference was where they led. Marcus wanted to follow them. I wanted to check one more cairn before committing. We compromised. Walk to the next cairn, check the GPS, and decide. At the next cairn, the GPS showed us clearly, diverging from the official route. But the cairns continued, confident and precise, descending off the bench into a narrowing side canyon. The walls were golden Navajo sandstone, smooth and steep, with a narrow strip of blue sky overhead. It was stunning. It was also a dead end. I could see the canyon terminating ahead in a dry pour-off, a 40-foot drop, bone dry, impassable without rope. Another 15 minutes of walking and we'd be standing at a cliff with nowhere to go but back. "Marcus, this doesn't go anywhere." He looked ahead, saw the pour-off, and swore quietly. We turned around and started climbing back toward the bench. The heat was pressing down now. I could feel it on my shoulders through my shirt, feel the rock surface throwing it back at my legs. Mid-morning in the swell, and the temperature was already in the high 80s, at least. I looked for the cairn at the transition point between bench and canyon. The first false one we'd followed. It had been 5 or 6 stones when we passed it 20 minutes ago. It was now 2 stones. I stopped walking. "Marcus." He looked. Then he looked further back along the slick rock, toward the bench. Another cairn, one I specifically remembered stepping past, was reduced to a single stone. And beyond that, the cairn before it was gone entirely. Just a scatter of flat rocks lying on the sandstone surface. Someone was dismantling the cairns behind us. I scanned the terrain in every direction. The slick rock bench was open. You'd think a person would be visible for a quarter mile or more, but sandstone isn't flat. It undulates, dips into shallow bowls, rises into low ridges and fins. The depressions aren't deep, maybe 2 or 3 feet, but they're enough. A person lying flat in one, or moving between them on hands and knees, would be invisible from 50 feet away. I thought I saw movement once, a faint shifting of light and shadow near a low ridge about 200 yards to the north. It could have been heat shimmer. It could have been a person changing position. "We're navigating by GPS," Marcus said. "Forget the cairns." He set a waypoint for the parking area, roughly 4.5 miles northeast, and we started walking on bearing. No trail, just compass direction and terrain. It was brutal. The slick rock bench gave way to loose sand, then a series of ledges that required detours, then a choked wash full of tamarisk that grabbed at our arms and packs. The heat was relentless. I checked our water at the 2-mile mark, less than a liter each, not dangerous yet, but not comfortable either. Marcus was sweating through his shirt. I could feel my lips cracking. We talked about water calculations. 2 miles left, maybe 90 minutes at this pace, roughly half a liter each. Tight but manageable if we didn't get lost. We couldn't afford to get lost. We hit the dirt access road about a quarter mile from the lot and followed it in. The relief I felt seeing the gravel was physical, a loosening in my chest, a release in my shoulders. Then I saw the Tahoe. It had moved. When we'd left that morning, it was backed into a space at the far end of the lot. Now it was parked directly behind our Subaru, close enough that backing out would be difficult. The man was not inside. Driver's door closed, windows up, engine off. Marcus stopped walking. We were about 100 feet from the vehicles. "Was it parked there before?" he asked. "No." We approached carefully. I looked through the Tahoe's windows as we passed. On the front passenger seat, binoculars and a folded topo map. On the floor, dusty leather work gloves. In the cargo area, visible through the rear glass, I could see a partial roll of orange survey tape and a fine coating of pale dust on the carpet, the kind of chalky residue that sandstone leaves when you handle it. Our Subaru appeared untouched, doors locked, windows intact. But I couldn't be certain nothing had been done to it. We hadn't thought to photograph it that morning. I pulled forward over the curb to get around the Tahoe and drove out on the dirt road. About a quarter mile from the lot, we passed a man walking along the shoulder. Gray t-shirt, same man, hands in his pockets, walking toward the parking area at an easy, unhurried pace. He looked directly at us through the windshield as we passed. Flat, steady eye contact. No wave, no change in expression. He held the look until we were past him, and then he was in the mirror, still walking, not turning around. Neither of us spoke for several miles. Then Marcus said, very quietly, "How did he get behind us?" We'd been on the trail nearly 5 hours. When we left, he was in his vehicle. Now his vehicle was moved and locked, and he was on foot, returning from some direction we couldn't determine. The Slick Rock bench was less than a mile from the parking area. A person who knew the terrain, who knew where the depressions were, where the sight lines broke, could move across it fast, staying low, staying invisible. I called the BLM field office the following week. The woman I spoke with took the details and said they'd previously received complaints about cairns being altered or removed in that area, but hadn't identified anyone responsible. She suggested we file a written report, which I did. I never heard anything further. But I think about that dead-end canyon, the golden walls, the pour-off, the narrow strip of sky overhead. We stood at the bottom of it for 10 minutes looking at a cliff. And in those 10 minutes, someone moved behind us in the silence and took apart the only markers that led back out. Whether he wanted our car, or whether he wanted us standing in a narrow canyon with no exit and no cell signal, I can't say. I just know that the cairns that let us in were built by someone, and the cairns that should have let us out were destroyed by someone. I can't prove the same person did both. I only know someone built a route into that canyon, and while we were inside, someone erased the way back. Story 4. The shortcut from the trail volunteer. Jenna and I had one rule when we hiked together. If either of us got a bad feeling about a route, a weather call, another person on the trail, we stopped. No negotiation, no overruling. One person's instinct was enough. We'd been operating that way for 4 years, and it had cost us nothing but a couple of shortened hikes. That September, it was worth considerably more. We were descending from a summit I'll call Mount Aldrich, a 12,000-footer on a national forest trail in central Colorado. Not a famous peak, not crowded, but a solid day hike with a maintained trail that we'd found through a local hiking group's recommendation. We'd reached the top by 10 that morning, eaten lunch, watching clouds stack up over the divide, and started down around 10:30. On the descent, Jenna pointed west toward the clouds. "That's building faster than the forecast said." She was right. The clouds were darker and lower than what the morning forecast had predicted, and they were moving in our direction. We picked up the pace. The plan was to be below tree line before noon, back at the car by early afternoon, well clear of any lightning. We'd seen maybe 6 or 7 other hikers on the ascent. On the way down, only 2. The mountain was emptying out as the weather moved in, which made the trail feel quieter than it should have on a Saturday. We met the man at about 11 o'clock, roughly 2 miles above the trailhead where the trail crossed a wide section of broken talus. He was standing just off the trail in a bright orange reflective vest over a dark fleece pullover, khaki pants, hiking boots, ball cap with no logo. A radio holster was clipped to his vest near the left shoulder, empty, the nylon flap hanging open. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, feet shoulder-width apart like someone at an information checkpoint. "Afternoon, folks. Wanted to give you a heads up, there's a pretty significant washout on the trail below here. We're routing hikers around on an alternate path until the crews get to it." He pointed to his left, toward a faint track that left the main trail and angled across a grassy slope before disappearing behind a low ridge. "Where exactly is the washout?" Jenna asked. Her voice was neutral, conversational. She wasn't suspicious yet. She was gathering information. About half a mile below, near the creek crossing on the switchback section, took out a good 60 feet of trail. I'd been on this trail that morning. The section he was describing had no creek crossing and no switchbacks. It was a direct descent through talus and alpine meadow. Either he was describing a different trail entirely, or he'd never walked this one. Jenna glanced at me. I could tell she'd caught the same discrepancy. "Which organization are you with?" she asked. "Front Range Trail Patrol. We coordinate with the Forest Service on busy weekends." He said it smoothly, like it was a fact he'd repeated many times. I looked at his vest. Plain orange nylon, the kind sold at hardware stores. No patches, no name tag, no affiliation. Every legitimate crew I'd encountered either worked in pairs or remained in radio contact, and most wore something identifying their organization. "Radio trouble?" I asked, looking at the empty holster. "Battery died early this morning." "Couldn't get a replacement up here?" He shrugged and gave an easy laugh. Jenna was studying his boots. She told me later that was the detail that decided it for her. The trail had been muddy from 2 days of afternoon thunderstorms. Every hiker we'd passed that day had mud on their boots. His were clean, not lightly dirty, clean. Soles, uppers, laces, like he'd put them on in a vehicle and walked 50 yards on dry rock to this spot. Then he said the thing that made it real. I'd mentioned heading back to the trailhead. He'd responded, "You'll want the alternate route if you're hoping to get back to your vehicle before this weather hits." Not the trailhead, not the parking area, your vehicle. As though he'd seen it, as though he knew which one was ours. Jenna said, "We'll take the main trail, thanks though." She was already walking when she said it, not rushing, just moving naturally, like the decision was barely worth discussing. I followed her. Something shifted in his face. The friendliness didn't drop, it reconfigured. The smile held, but it became a different smile, the kind that isn't connected to anything behind it. "Wouldn't recommend it," he said to our backs. "Couple people already turned around." Neither of us responded. We descended fast. Within 5 minutes, we passed a man and a woman coming up. The first hikers we'd seen in a while, and I stopped and asked if they'd had any trouble with the trail below. The woman looked puzzled. "No, it's fine. Why?" "Someone up there told us there was a washout." They exchanged glances. We just came through, trails totally clear. Jenna looked at me. "Can you tell them?" she said. "About the man?" I described him, the vest, the radio holster, the story about the washout. I told them the trail was fine and to be cautious if he tried to redirect them. The couple thanked us and continued up. Whether they encountered him, I don't know. We kept moving. Jenna set the pace, and it was aggressive, close to a jog on the downhill grades, hard on the knees, both of us breathing heavily. After about 15 minutes, I looked back up the trail. He was there. 300 yards above us, maybe more, walking in our direction, not hurrying, matching our pace precisely, the way someone maintains a fixed distance. "He's following us," I said. Jenna didn't look back. "I know, keep moving." We dropped below a ridge and lost sight of the upper trail. When the next clear view opened up, he was gone. The trail behind us was empty. No orange vest, no movement, nothing. He'd left the trail, either cutting cross-country toward the trailhead or angling toward the ridge that separated the main trail from the alternate route he'd been pushing. Jenna said, He's going to the road. She was thinking faster than I was. The alternate path curved behind that low ridge and descended to the northwest, away from the trailhead but toward a dirt service road visible on our map. If the man had left the main trail to cut cross-country to that service road, he could reach it before we reached the parking lot. We practically ran the last mile. The parking lot had 15 or so cars in it, including ours. Jenna went straight to the car and started the engine while I scanned the area. Past the trailhead kiosk at the far end of the lot, a dirt service road branched off the main access and ran along the base of the mountain to the north. Parked on that road, maybe 200 yards from the lot, was a dark blue pickup truck. No front plate, no markings, no visible equipment in the bed. It was idling, exhaust drifting from the tailpipe. The service road connected to the area where the alternate route would have emerged. If we'd followed his directions, that path would have brought us over the ridge, down the grassy slope, and out onto that service road, away from the lot, away from the other vehicles, away from anyone who might see us. I got in the car. Jenna pulled out immediately, driving faster than the gravel wanted. I watched the mirror the entire way down the access road. The truck didn't appear behind us, but I never saw it leave either. We called the county sheriff's office that afternoon. The deputy took the report, recorded the vehicle description, and said he'd circulate it. He confirmed that the Forest Service had no authorized volunteer crew assigned to that trail that day. He didn't speculate about what the man was doing. He didn't need to. Jenna and I still hiked together. We still followed the rule. That morning on the mountain, she didn't weigh the evidence or ask me what I thought. She said, "We'll take the main trail," and she started walking. The conversation lasted 4 seconds. I don't know what was supposed to happen at the end of that alternate route. I don't know who was in the truck. But someone stood on a mountain trail in a costume made of a $5 vest and an empty holster, and he pointed people toward a path that didn't lead to safety. His clean boots suggested he hadn't reached that point on the muddy trail we'd just walked. He had come in another way. Story 5. The Downloaded Trail. This happened the summer after graduation. My two closest friends, Ethan and Dave, and I had rented a cabin near Baxter State Park in northern Maine for a week of hiking. We'd done Catadine on day 2, knocked out a couple of shorter trails in the 100-mile wilderness, and by the 4th morning we were looking for something we hadn't seen on any best of list, something remote. That's when Ethan found the route. He'd been browsing a regional hiking forum, not one of the big platforms, just a smaller community board for northern New England. A user called Northmain_hiker had posted a GPS track for a trail called Loon Pond Spur. The post described it as a 5.8-mile out and back through boreal forest to a remote pond with good fishing access. Quiet, isolated, worth the drive. The post had been up about 4 months and had 8 or 9 comments underneath, all positive. Beautiful spot. Totally secluded. Had the whole place to myself. Go before everyone finds out. I looked over Ethan's shoulder as he scrolled through them. Dave was making coffee at the kitchen counter. "Who posted it?" I asked. Ethan clicked on the username. Northmain_hiker had created the account 6 months earlier. They'd posted in a few general threads before sharing the GPS track, questions about waterproof boots, a comment about road conditions near Greenville, light activity, enough to look like a real person. "What about the comments?" I said. Ethan scrolled through them. profiles were sparse. Most had been created within a few months of each other. A couple had posted elsewhere on the forum, basic gear questions, a reply in a thread about trail conditions on Katahdin. But Loon Pond was the only trail any of them had specifically recommended. That's kind of weird, I said. Every one of those accounts is basically new. Dave looked up from his coffee. It's a small forum. New people join all the time. Ethan agreed. If the trail just got posted a few months ago, the people commenting on it are going to be the people who found it recently. That's how forums work. They weren't wrong. On a niche community board, a cluster of new accounts around a new post isn't automatically suspicious. I let it go. That was my mistake, and I've thought about it often. Dave downloaded the GPS track and opened it in Gaia. The route started from a pull-off on a logging road about 40 minutes north of the cabin. The track was clean and precise. Someone had walked it with a GPS device and recorded the path carefully. The route didn't appear on any official map, but user-generated tracks in Maine timberland are common. Logging roads, hunting paths, old fishing access routes. They exist by the thousands, maintained by use rather than by any agency. We drove north the next morning. The logging road was rough but drivable. After 6 miles of gravel, we found the pull-off, a widened shoulder near a culvert where a stream crossed under the road. No other vehicles, no trailhead sign, no kiosk, just gravel, forest, and silence. Dave pulled up the GPS track. It showed the trail beginning on the east side of the road. We walked to the spot and found a narrow gap in the spruce where the lower branches had been trimmed back, creating a corridor just wide enough to walk through single file. Inside, tied to a branch at chest height, was a small rectangle of orange flagging tape. Below it, a flat piece of wood had been nailed to the tree. A painted arrow pointed into the forest. Below the arrow, in the same paint, the word Loon. Ethan looked at us. This is it. The trail was narrow but clearly maintained, by hand, not machinery. Branches had been cut with loppers. In soft ground, someone had laid sections of split log as stepping stones. The flagging tape appeared every 100 feet or so, consistent in placement and height. The GPS track on Dave's phone matched the physical trail precisely. For the first mile, I had no concerns. The forest was dense spruce fir, dark and hushed, with a floor of sphagnum moss and bunchberry. The trail climbed gently along a low ridge. Water was audible off to the left somewhere. The air smelled like balsam and wet earth. It felt exactly like what the forum post had promised, a quiet, well-kept trail to a hidden pond. At approximately 1.2 miles, I noticed the first camera. A trail camera, dark green and brown housing, the kind hunters use, strapped to a spruce trunk about 8 feet up, angled downward toward the trail. I spotted it only because the sun caught the lens for a moment as I passed beneath it. I stopped and pointed it out. Dave said what I expected. Game camera. Hunters set them months ahead of season to pattern deer. This was timberland. Hunting was common. Sure, I said, but it's pointed at the trail, not at a game corridor, at the trail. Ethan looked up at it. Some people set them on trails. Deer use trails too. I didn't push it. We kept walking. At about 1.8 miles, I found another camera. Different tree, opposite side of the trail, mounted slightly lower. This one was aimed straight down the path, not at an angle that would capture an animal moving through the undergrowth, but directly along the corridor of cleared trees, at the height of a person's face. Dave saw this one, without me pointing it out. He stopped walking. "Okay," he said. "That's not a game camera." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Could be someone monitoring the property. If this is private timberland, they might want to know who's walking through." "Then why build a trail and invite people to walk through it?" I said. Nobody had an answer. I pulled out my phone and opened the USGS terrain layer. Not the downloaded GPS track, but the base topo map. Our position showed us far from any marked public trail or maintained road. The GPS track from the forum was leading us along a precise line across terrain to the base map treated as blank, past cameras positioned to photograph anyone on the path. I scrolled ahead on the track. About 3/4 of a mile further, it passed close to a small square symbol on the topo. A structure? "There's a building ahead," I said, "about 3/4 of a mile." Dave looked at the map. Ethan looked at the forest. "We go back," Dave said. It wasn't a suggestion. We turned around. On the return, I searched for cameras deliberately. I found one more, mounted on the same side of the trail as the first, positioned to capture a slightly different angle. 3 cameras in 2 miles, all oriented at the trail, all at face height or close to it. There may have been others I missed. About half a mile from the road, I noticed something I'd walked past on the way in without seeing. Off the trail to the right, perhaps 80 feet back, partially concealed by a dense stand of young spruce, sat a small single-wide trailer. Old, weathered, with dark material covering the windows, heavy plastic or fabric, impossible to tell from that distance. No power lines ran to it, no generator sound, no vehicle nearby. A padlocked chain secured the door. The trees around it had been allowed to grow in close, screening it from the trail. If you were walking at a normal pace and looking ahead, you'd never see it. I only noticed it because I was scanning the forest on both sides, looking for cameras, looking for anything that didn't belong. Ethan stared at it. Dave took a step off the trail in its direction. "Don't," I said. "We don't go near it. We go to the car." Dave stopped. He looked at the trailer for another few seconds, then turned and kept walking. We reached the road, got in the car, and drove south without discussion. The silence lasted several minutes. Then Ethan from the back seat said what all of us were thinking. Someone made that trail. Someone put up those cameras. Someone uploaded that route so people like us would walk right past all of it. And somebody's watching the footage. That evening at the cabin, I went through the forum post carefully. I examined each commenter's profile. The pattern was consistent. Accounts created within a window of a few months, light activity in general threads to build credibility, and then a single enthusiastic comment about Loon Pond Spur. Every one of them emphasized isolation. You'll have the whole place to yourself. Didn't see another person? Miles from anyone? Nobody else on this trail? They weren't recommending a hike. They weren't describing scenery or a pond or fishing or the quality of the forest. They were telling potential hikers, over and over, that no one would be around, that they would be alone. I also checked a public parcel overlay for the area. The land the trail crossed was not listed for public recreational access. It was privately held commercial timberland. I couldn't find any listed public easement or recreational access agreement for the route. Whoever built the trail and uploaded the GPS track was bringing people onto private property, past surveillance cameras toward a structure, and doing it through a careful, patient campaign of fake accounts and curated recommendations, We went to the county sheriff's office the next day. The deputy spent an hour with us. He was serious and detailed, took screenshots of the forum post, copied our GPS data, noted the camera locations, and the trailer's position as precisely as we could describe it. He asked us not to return to the area. Within 2 weeks, the forum post was gone. The account was deleted. All the comments vanished. I never learned whether the cameras were removed, whether anyone investigated the trailer, or whether the GPS track resurfaced somewhere else under a different name on a different platform. The deputy didn't follow up with us, and I didn't call back. Part of me didn't want to know the answer, but I kept a screenshot of the forum post before it disappeared. I look at it sometimes. The careful language, the patient construction, all those recently created accounts saying the same thing in slightly different words. You'll be completely alone out there. That wasn't a recommendation. It was a promise, and not to the hikers. Those are 5 stories about trails that didn't belong where they were found, and the people who may have put them there. Every one of them started with something simple: a ribbon, a cairn, a friendly stranger, a GPS track, and led somewhere it shouldn't have. If you've ever come across an unmarked route, a misleading marker, or a trail that took you somewhere it wasn't supposed to, we'd like to hear about it. Leave your experience in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people have a story like this and have never told anyone. If these stories kept you up tonight, hit like and subscribe to Mind After Dark. We put a lot of care into these, and your support is what keeps them coming. We'll be back soon with more. Stay safe out there. And the next time you're on a trail, take a second to check whether it's really on the map. Because if it isn't, somebody put it there. And they had a reason,